hasn't replied to your email. He hasn't replied to your email, but I don't think so. Yeah, that was the idea.
Okay. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to everyone here. We are delighted to have you join us for this event, which is Loss and Damage Across Humanitarian Action and Development, from Response to Resilient Recovery. I'm Mary Friel from the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, which represents 191 national societies of local staff and volunteers taking action before, during and after a disaster. And it's my pleasure to be able to open this session and to moderate today on behalf of Mercy Corps, Concern Worldwide, IFRC, all on behalf of the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance. This alliance has come together for over 10 years to build community-based action and resilience to flood risk. It brings together humanitarian actors, development actors, the private sector and research, as well in academia. And this event today on resilient recovery could not be more timely or important, and we're delighted to have you all here today with the historic start to this COP, with the Loss and Damage Fund agreement going through, early pledges, and also decisions moving quickly on the Santiago network on loss and damage, expecting cleaner text or clean text later today or tomorrow. So thank you for joining us in this discussion. When we think of recovery, it's a highly personal experience when a disaster hits. It's highly personal what the impacts mean to you, what it means to your family, what it means to your community. The impacts are always felt most acutely at the local and community level, and the answers also lie there. But too often we see the gap in providing support to communities to be able to recover effectively after a disaster strikes. And this is becoming all too more serious with the impacts of climate change. We know that recovery doesn't just happen, that pre-planning is absolutely essential, and that's laws, policy, plans, coordination, involving and supporting community groups to identify what are their needs ahead of a disaster and getting the right finance in place to be able to act quickly, not just in response, but into early recovery to build resilience. And so what we need is an approach which helps to build better synergy between the two, from response to resilient recovery. And this new report, which we will hear shortly all about, which is a new report from the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance called Towards Transformative Action, the Unfulfilled Promise of Resilient Recovery, helps to answer some of the key questions. What is this, and what could that approach look like? What does that mean for national action, and what does it mean for international cooperation and action, especially linked to the new Loss and Damage Fund decision? What is clear is there's an opportunity. What's clear is there's gaps, significant gaps, But there's also a really positive opportunity for change and to build something different together with the new decisions. So we'll hear more in the opening presentation from Barbara Jacobson, who's the Senior Advocacy Advisor for Mercy Corps and working for Zephyr as well, who will talk us through the key findings of the report to help contextualise the discussion that we will have today. We are absolutely delighted to be joined by our fantastic panel of speakers to bring together analysis from the local, national to global level. We've got Jackson McKinney, who's the Food Security and Livelihoods Coordinator at Concern Worldwide in Kenya. You're most welcome and thank you for joining us. We've also got Priska Chisala, who's the Director of Programs and Development for the Malawi Red Cross. Again, thank you. We're delighted that you can join us. Nemo Hassan, again, we're absolutely thrilled that you're with us today, who leads the Somalia NGO Consortium. And then finally, Sani Ramos Higelios, who is the Senior Advisor for UNDP on Disaster Risk Reduction, Recovery and Building Resilience. So all experts in this topic, and we look forward to hearing your reflections. I would just invite people in the spirit of entering into this discussion and engaging in this panel to invite you as well to reflect on what does resilient recovery mean to you? What does it mean in your life? What does it mean in terms of your working life? How does it relate to your lived experience and the challenges and the gaps and the frustrations that you see? We invite you to be curious and to connect either during the session or as you leave with those who you're sitting beside or a new person that you've not met before to talk about what does this mean and are there opportunities to act and think differently. And critically to focus on who's currently being left behind and are there different ways of behaving to better respond to the recovery needs and gaps. So with that, we hope to get back to you later in the session on that and to hear some thoughts and questions. We also hope to be joined by Mackay Robertson, who's been sitting on the Transitional Committee this year, a familiar face and a fantastic expert on all things loss and damage to help guide us as well in this discussion on how does this connect with the global level. But to kick things off, I just want to introduce Barbara Jacobson again, who will kindly talk us through the findings of the new report. Thanks, Barbara.
Thank you, Mary, and hi, everyone. Indeed, we have recently published a report on behalf of the Zurich Alliance about resilient recovery, and there are many important reasons why we chose this topic to focus our report on. As Mary already mentioned, the climate crisis is devastating, and not only do we see more intense hazards, they are arising more and more frequently, and there is a very deadly mix of hazards that communities are facing. For example, if we look at the Horn of Africa, which was faced with devastating droughts and now devastating floods. So following these disasters, immediate relief is mobilized, and we all know that this is not yet nearly enough. The relief is mobilized by communities themselves, by humanitarians, and there's even some early recovery, but there's limited investment into actual recovery and actual building back better. And at the same time, this could be an opportunity, this recovery phase. We could include resilience into recovery and enhance the resilience of these populations so that they are better prepared for the next disasters. In fact, this can be transformational when it's done right. And yet, even though its potential is great, it remains underfunded and it remains deprioritized. So we created this report, and the first question that we wanted to answer is, how do we understand resilient recovery? What is it even? Is it building back better? Is it something else? So we looked at the recovery phase in the disaster risk management cycle. And it is in this kind of famous cycle, it is a distinct phase, and it follows relief. It's a phase before risk reduction. But we all know that in practice, the reality is much more messy. Often disasters coincide and communities often still recover when they go from one event to the next. For example, I was recently in Nepal where a household was recovering or was building back their house 7 years after the flood. So we can probably better think of recovery as happening throughout this cycle. And first, we are starting with early recovery that needs to lay the foundations for the recovery to come in the relief phase. Then we are going to longer, medium and longer term recovery, where investments can be made to build resilience for communities, which then in turn feeds into risk reduction efforts and enhances these risk reduction efforts. And then finally, which is really important, and Mary also already touched on this, it is very important not to just be prepared for relief, but also enhance preparedness for recovery. And this means pre-arranging finance, this means pre-arranging contractors, it means having a proper regulatory environment. And so we see that this all needs to happen across the DRM cycle. And then when we zoom into the elements of resilient recovery, we see that it shouldn't just be building back better, but it should be a lot more. And we will see that in this diagram. First of all, it needs to be risk informed. Recovery needs to integrate climate science and have a multi-hazard scope. So if we want to truly make communities prepared for the future, we need to know what that future is. Second, we see resilience as something very multidimensional. It's not just physical infrastructure, as I said. It's also about restoring livelihoods. It's about restoring ecosystems. And this needs to happen in a very holistic way using multi-sectoral data. And then finally, recovery needs to be inclusive. And this not only means that solutions need to be found that are appropriate for all, but also that marginalized people are proactively included into the design and operationalization of recovery frameworks. So talking about these frameworks, this is all very nice in practice, but how do you actually create an enabling environment for recovery? And there has been a really excellent report published this year as well by the IFRC, and they examined all kinds of disaster laws in different countries, and they found that recovery was only mentioned or addressed in 16% of these laws. So the actual pre-planning and policy making for recovery remains incredibly rare, whereas this is exactly what is needed, as waiting until after a disaster is often too late. And these recovery frameworks, again, needs to be risk-informed, multidimensional and inclusive, but they also need to be underpinned by capacity sharing, data and learning, and continuous updating, because we all know that our world is changing very fast. Oh. At the global level, this all needs to be supported as well. And at the same time, we see, because this is such a cross-cutting issue, we see that it is addressed in multiple sectors, but at the same time also often falls in between them. So for example, in the DRR sector, we see that recovery, yes, it is a distinct phase, but actually building back better remains inconsistent. And according to the review of the Sendai framework this year, there have been many missed opportunities to enhance resilience in recovery. Recovery also kind of falls in this in between humanitarian development approaches, and so kind of in this humanitarian development nexus. And while early recovery is formally a part of an emergency response phase, the transition towards longer term recovery is often very inconsistent. And then finally, what we're all here for, the climate side, recovery has so far not been discussed very much in the climate negotiations. We see it changing now with the adoption of the Loss and Damage Fund, which could be a very interesting opportunity. And at the same time, we also see that if we want to make a really enhance resilience in this recovery phase, we also need to talk to adaptation professionals and kind of excite adaptation professionals to already start implementing adaptation in the recovery phase, and not just when, the situation is much more calm. And then all of this obviously needs to be financed, and there are massive challenges here. At the national level, we see that there is still very much a reliance on kind of a patchwork of funding sources, all very limited. Funds are often prioritized for emergency response, and which makes a lot of sense, but it does mean that very little is left for recovery, and let alone resilient recovery. And there's limited pre-planned finance arrangements, also because there is just a lack of preparedness and frameworks in these countries. And then at the international level, we see very limited grant funding for recovery. And often this is, again, prioritized for relief, early relief, but not necessarily for the recovery phase or building resilience into recovery. And recovery is often financed by loans, which are just enhancing the debt crisis in many countries. So when we look into solutions on recovery financing, we see a couple of things that could help. First of all, at the national level, we need to enhance pre-planned financing with explicit criteria for supporting resilience. And at the same time, at the international level, we need to encourage new and additional sources of funding. We need to avoid debt burdens, and we need to provide incentives for building resilience, for example, through technical assistance. And throughout all of this, we also need to excite the private sector for the opportunity of resilient recovery, because down the line, it can save a lot of money to think about resilience now and avoid losses and damages in the future. And then finally, of course, all of this needs to be very inclusive and gender responsive. So, to conclude, a couple of overarching messages that I want to leave you with. First of all, resilient recovery really represents an opportunity. And this opportunity can be taken, but there are a couple of obstacles that we need to address. And first of all, this opportunity cannot be leveraged without proper pre-planning, proper pre-arranged finance, frameworks, laws, and policies that make the recovery and resilient recovery conducive. And then the second of all, it needs financing. It needs financing that doesn't create debt, but that empowers communities. And it needs a concerted effort at all levels, whether it is from local authorities or national authorities or us sitting in this room. Everyone has a role to play in recovery because it's so multidimensional. And we need to proactively cross these silos. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that very clear overview, and I think some clear principles and areas for us all to consider. What we were clearly hearing is for resilient recovery to be risk-informed, to be based and really connected and grounded in national planning, law, policy, practice, coordination, that we need to find ways to bridge the gaps which has communities leading and driving that process. And critically then the finance question as well of how do we ensure that this can move fast post-disaster to have a smoother transition between response and recovery. We've got a fantastic panel with us today, and I want to kick off firstly with Jackson, who joins us from Concern Worldwide in Kenya, livelihoods, food nutrition expert, and has been working through some series of crises, both drought and floods, and really keen to get a sense from you, what are the key gaps when it comes to resilient recovery, and what are the impacts on people as a result of those gaps? And thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us this evening from this hall. My name is Jackson, and I'm from Nairobi, Kenya. Just to inform us where Kenya is. Kenya is at the Horn of Africa, the east Horn of Africa, and we are a country that is 80% in the arid and semi-arid region, where 20% of our land is what we can call as arable land. So majority of our population that is affected by the disasters, we're talking about drought and mostly flooding. is in the ASAL region. So this ASAL region, I'll paint a scenario on how it works. Kenya is very big, and in terms of policy environment, we have very good policies around climate. I think I count them, we are in upwards of between 15 and 20 policies around climate, both at the national and the subnational level. The policies, some are funded, some are not funded, either funded to the right direction or not. That is a point that you will be able to judge by the end of this conversation. So, in the last 2 years, Kenya has faced one of the worst droughts that is beyond my lifetime. It's a drought that has affected us for 2 years, 5 consecutive failed rainfall seasons. Rainfall seasons in Kenya happen between March to May and October to December. So consecutively, you miss that for 5 seasons. And the worst affected communities are in the ASAL, the pastoral communities, which form 80% of our land mass in the country. Households in this area lost up to 50% of their livelihood, and we're talking about livestock. This is what they know best. They know nothing else beyond herding livestock. So pastoralism, as we know it, has changed over that period. The investments, if we had investments, so to say, that will protect the loss, then maybe this household would not have lost in upwards of 50% of their livestock. For those who are not pastoral farmers, I will paint another picture that the gestation period for a cow is it's a year, but for you to regenerate your stock, it will take you roughly 5 years to have the same livestock in your herd as you had before, if you lose 50% of it. So it takes a cow 1 year. However, the 1 year assumes the conditions are favorable, that you didn't have any drought, nor did you have any flooding. There was no stress to the animal. That way it will be able to produce within the 1 year. It also assumes that the animal is a female adult animal. Okay? So you lost every other animal and left the female adults. And that's not the scenario. I mean, it's not a linear, the world is not linear. So you must have lost many female ones because they're susceptible to pests and diseases, and they all went. So with these conditions, it will take you 4 to 5 years to regain your herd. However, Kenya is not just faced by drought. After every long drought, like the one we've had in the last 2 years, we experience flooding. Currently, in the last 3 months, you've experienced one of the worst flooding also. The last, I think, we had, it's not something I can remember. We had something of a similar sort in 2018, but not to the same magnitude. So what you're talking after a long drought, it's immediately followed by a long period of flooding that affects the same areas. If it's an ASAL area, the chances are it's a low-lying area, so it will be swept. The water comes, sweeps all whatever was left by the flood. Now this time it will not just sweep the livestock that are in the domicile at the household level, or whatever is domicile at the household level. It will go with it soil, it will go with it the infrastructure that was there, either water infrastructure, road infrastructure, market infrastructure. So whatever you're trying to use to recover will be taken by the flooding. It's a trend that you've seen happen in the last 15 years. So what you're seeing is after this flooding, we'll have a favorable condition for a very short period of time. For sure, we will have another drought in the next 3 years. When there's a flooding, the drought period is shortened when we have the next drought. So we're talking about, we are in 2023, by around 2027 thereabout, we expect another drought. Are we prepared as a nation? We doubt, because the investments to adaptation, to ensuring that the communities are resilient, is not there yet. Now that our infrastructure is gone, our water resources have been affected. All the water, we say it's been taken to the ocean because we bought the Indian Ocean, but that's not true. I think what I say mostly is we've not harnessed this resource that has gone to the ocean and has gone with it with a number of other productive assets. So it will take us time to recover. 2 years of drought, 3 months of flooding. Recovery will take us 2-3 years before you even think of recovering. Another drought is here, and the cycle will continue. So unless we invest more beyond the policies that we have sitting in our government offices, sitting here, I'm sure some of the discussion we're having here will revolve around agreements, policies, collaboration, letters of collaboration that will require to be taken back to our countries, agreed within our parliaments. But as long as those ones do not translate into improving the capacities of the communities where we work in to be able to respond, be adaptive, be resilient to their setup, then we are a long way there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackson. A very clear message that what we're talking about in reality is 3 to 5 years minimum for recovery for pastoralist communities. And if you're not taking the opportunity to integrate adaptation, to integrate resilience, then we're setting communities up for further disasters. And that's a really clear challenge in terms of how do we work better and how can we get better investments and support and funding to communities who need it most. Priska, if I could turn to you next. You have been responding to Cyclone Freddy with the Malawi Red Cross, and that came off the back as well of a severe cholera outbreak in the country, and again, compounding impacts of different crises. Could you share a little bit about what are some of the gaps that you're seeing in terms of resilient recovery and how that impacts at the local level and for community groups?
Thank you very much. I think for Malawi, the situation is somehow similar to what our colleague from Kenya have just mentioned. Yes, to talk about the tropical cyclone Freddy that we had earlier this year. This tropical cyclone Freddy had affected populations that were also hit with cyclones for the past few years. We talk of 2019, we had cyclones. 2022, we had cyclones, meaning to say it hit the populations that had not yet fully recovered. And again, we were facing the impacts of the tropical cyclone Freddy, mainly floods, at a time when already the country was battling with cholera, a climate-sensitive outbreak that had also hit the entire country. So again, making the entire situation complicated. The very same people that are vulnerable, making them even more vulnerable. Again, we talk of issues of food insecurity because drought is also an issue in Malawi as far as climate-induced disasters are concerned. So you can see that the vulnerabilities are being exacerbated in the very same populations. And as Malawi Red Cross Society, in our auxiliary role to public authorities, we've been working with the government to support in terms of intervening before, during, and after disasters. So what happened, especially on the tropical cyclone Freddy that we're discussing now, is that when we got the advisories from the Department of Meteorological Services through our pool of volunteers, we were able to disseminate the very same information amongst the populations that were predicted to be affected. So at least we were able to support in terms of saving lives, because with the messages, the early warning messages that we provided, the people that we in places that we at least they were able to move. So they were able to act with speed based on the advisory that we had provided. But also we were also able to set aside non-food items, like so prepositioning non-food items was also one of the interventions that we did as a way of supporting or acting to the advisories. Beyond that, we also already started supporting the communities to be able to evacuate. So identification of evacuation sites was also another element that we looked at. And the good thing is, us as Red Cross, we also have already a structure that is trained to be able to just be on standby so that we can respond with speed when a disaster has happened. So what happened was, when the disaster happened, we already had trained teams that are able to provide, for example, search and rescue activities, first aid and all that. Meaning to say, we were still with the people to just support with relief interventions. But as we speak, we have continued supporting the very same people. I'm happy to see in this room, I've seen some colleagues from the government, and we are very happy that at least Malawi Red Cross is one of the actors that have still been there just to make sure that we support the affected populations to recover, at least to get back to their original state, or at least to a better state. And in terms of interventions that we are supporting these affected populations with recovery, we are looking at an integrated approach. I think it was mentioned at the very beginning during the opening remarks in terms of the frameworks around resilient, where we need to really look at a multi-sectoral approach to our interventions. So we've been supporting the affected populations with several interventions. One of it is provision of shelter. And in terms of provision of shelter, our focus again is building back better. So we are saying these people are faced with the same disasters year in, year out. As I mentioned of floods, we have at least populations that do face floods year in, year out. But what we're saying is, how can we make sure that when these floods have affected them, they should not be affected that much, or at least they should be able to cope or adapt. So we make sure that the houses that we are constructing are multi-hazard resilient, in a way that even if you were to go in the affected areas, at least some of the structures that we have supported the populations that we affect are still standing, although we'll be talking of shelter as part of the damages that happened when these disasters happened. Again, we are looking at WASH as an area that we are also supporting. So we are trying to make sure that we provide safe water sources, but also our volunteers are trained with various preventive messages, because we are saying when these floods have happened, they also create a very breeding environment for climate-sensitive outbreaks such as cholera. So again, when this was happening, I think we were still talking about COVID-19, and you will see that the preventive measures of COVID-19 and cholera are in a way the same. And if we had the volunteers that were already trained on various hygiene behaviors, practices, and all that, they were also able to just act with speed when the disasters have happened. So we are looking at, yes, we are using these volunteers throughout the disaster risk management cycle. And apart from the WASH, shelter, we are also looking at nutrition as an area that we are focusing on. When disasters have happened, children, under 5 children, mothers get affected so badly. So it's also an area that we look at to say probably can't we look at probably locally led solutions around promoting maternal and child health. So again, these are some of the areas. So in a way, we are really making sure that there is an inclusiveness in terms of our targeting. So we don't want to leave anyone else behind, but also any sector, we don't want to leave it behind. And if you look at the loss and damage that happened from this tropical cyclone, Freddy, you will see again that different sectors were affected. We talk of the infrastructure, roads infrastructure were affected. The housing sector was highly affected. But when we look at the available funding, you will also see that partners also have their own areas of interest. So for example, the shelter is one of the areas that was highly affected, and yet it has received less support. And yet we are talking about creating resilient communities. How do we create resilient communities in the absence of finances? I think it's really important that when we look at, we want to really support the affected populations, we need not to consider the division between the humanitarian aid, the development aid, private sector funding and all that, but we need to look at what are the needs on the ground. And then we need to involve the people that are affected, because they understand the communities better. These people have information in terms of what interventions they want to have, what interventions work in the areas. I have just talked about an example of the shelters that we do construct in the houses. I'm sure if you go back to the communities, they'll be able to tell you that. So at times you'll find that a partner is coming wanting to support WASH sector, and yet the needs of the people is food insecurity. So it's really important that our interventions should be informed by the needs and the context that we are dealing with. And then the voice of the people that are affected must be central in terms of defining our interventions. Thank you.
Thanks, Priska. A very clear point heard on the need to invest in community preparedness and for communities to be leading in all aspects of recovery. And also a very important point around health and climate and some of the measures and supports that can be put in place for COVID or a climate-related disaster or for cholera, investing in people, investing in communities, investing in that action is what's necessary across all types of crisis. And it was interesting to see yesterday the climate and health element going on the presidency agenda, and also the relief, recovery and peace focus as well. And our next panellist, Nemo, gave a beautiful closing at the Climate, Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration. And I wonder if you might mind sharing your reflections after yesterday. What are some of the gaps that you're facing and the particular challenges within fragile, conflict-affected contexts, and how do you see this potentially addressing or acknowledging some of those gaps?
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel today. It's my first COP. I'm not a climate expert, but I do know a lot of what happens on the ground in places like Somalia. I was in this very same seat earlier on talking about Somali issues and how the communities are impacted. So I actually worked in the coordination sector for the last 3 years, since 2020, the height of COVID-19. Before that, I did development projects in more stable areas in Somalia, where we were supporting secondary education with teacher training, developing quality assurance and curriculums. So really tangible stuff. Now in the coordination, particularly in the humanitarian sector, it's a completely different type of work, and it needs a different type of mindset. The climate-related crises are very visible in places like Somalia, the Horn of Africa, and the impact it has on the community, especially in a more fragile and conflict context. So, as you rightly said, we've recently had 5 failed rainy seasons in Somalia, the worst drought in the history. And within a couple of months, we're now having El Niño floods. So the same communities that were impacted by the drought are now dealing with the floods, being displaced third, fourth, fifth time within the same community, within the same locality. So the situation is very real to those communities. Loss of life and livelihoods due to drought and due to floods as well. Yes, so yesterday I was part of the event on the launching of the Declaration for Climate Relief, Recovery and Peace. And it's really an important milestone. It's a decision which puts these countries and these contexts on the table. But a lot more needs to be done. A lot more needs to be done. I remember when I started working here on the coordination and looking at localization and the ground bargain, a lot of the local partners who are within the membership of our network would say to me, it's been 6 years, 7 years, we're still talking about the ground bargain. We've not seen any real change on the ground. We still have the same types of partnerships, well, more like sub-granting to them. We talk about equitable partnerships. Funding still remains very low. So the real question is, how would this declaration be different to, or the loss and damage fund that was announced as well? Again, another great milestone. But how is always the difficult question. How will that materialize in changing the lives of the people that we see in and day out that are suffering? How will they access climate financing? We talked about not leaving anyone behind. We're miles away from the communities who have nothing much to do with the state of the planet, but yet are suffering because of the actions of others. And And it's nice and easy to speak here and say, we're leaving people behind, we're not doing enough, more needs to be done. But who is taking that responsibility to ensure that we have access and they have access to the right resources and to the right information and to the right technical support? And are they being heard? Is the indigenous knowledge and the way people coped being preserved and being part of the conversation and part of the response, right? So I think those are the key questions. And if I'm taking anything away from these conversations, is that the work is only just starting. We need to keep on pushing. We need to hold ourselves accountable, hold each other accountable, our organizations, institutions, and hold the politicians accountable. So if by the end of COP that this loss and damage is still inaccessible to communities, then how do we measure? How do we measure success? Is success the declaration on its own, or is it the results that the ambitions of the results that it wants to see? And I think it's important how we're measuring success. So the gap for Somalia, the gap between policy, institutions, and the need are very big, very big. So you have a failed state for 30 years. Systems are being built now. A whole way of living a whole set of cultures have to change, because now you're talking about trauma, from all of the problems that have been happening to you, and the healing, and still there are areas which are not accessible to any of us to try and reach. So we see those who we are reaching, but there are a whole set of communities that we don't reach so much because it's inaccessible, it's not secure, even for some of the national actors as well. So a big debate and discussion to be had, but also focus on the implementation to bridge the gap between policy and practice. Thank you.
I think a very clear message that implementation and the practical difference that people and communities feel has to be the measure of success. I think what we heard yesterday can only be a signal, and we can only measure that in terms of how that progresses in the coming months. And I think we've all got a job to do on this panel and in the room to support and help to hold that accountability and delivery as well, because people are being left behind. They are left behind. And with that, in terms of thinking a little bit more about where some of the gaps are in integrating Building Back Better, and where there are strengths as well within current policy. Really delighted that we have Sani from UNDP join us on the panel, and we'd love to hear your reflections on where you think that is in terms of the integration of Build Back Better, and also the kind of health of the nexus and all of this conversation. It's thrown as one of the kind of answers, and yeah, we really struggle to get sort of practical scale and action on that. So over to you, and we look forward to hearing your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you very much, Mary, and fellow panelists. Good afternoon, and colleagues who are in the audience. Let me start with a little bit of what is Build Back Better, no? Because the most recent one we heard about Build Back Better was when the White House, President Joe Biden, talked about Build Back Better in the context of climate action. But I go back to when it all started during the Indian Ocean tsunami, when Build Back Better was first mentioned and used through the intervention of the special envoy to the tsunami countries, former President Bill Clinton, who actually prepared 10 propositions on how to build back better. I was already working with UNDP. In fact, I was already working in Banda Aceh at that time. And how it was applied at that time was, those 10 points was used to measure and filter the proposals being proposed by various organizations, through the BRR Aceh under the leadership of who was the BRR Aceh leader, Dr. Kusantoro. And it was tough because many of the humanitarian agencies were not used to the principles of Build Back Better. But it was used. And fast forward today, Banda Aceh is a dynamically, economically strong province. And if you remember, during that time, it was a lot of conflict. The Build Back Better principle and approaches brought actually a lot of development interventions that actually does just build back them to the pre-disaster condition, but actually much better than what it used to be. Remember, because of the conflict. Now, through the years, and I'm referring to your first question, through the years, however, there's still no clarity what it means by build back better. Some are using build back safer. And when I work in support of the Sichuan earthquake in China in 2008, the mantra was not build back better, but it was build back greener. So it was only enshrined in 2015 during the Sendai Framework for DRR that build back better became the safe, the mantra, the slogan, and it's now, as Barbara had said, it's in part of the priority 4 of Sendai Framework. So a lot of history, and myself and in my responsibility, we're actually investigating and studying the same questions that you posed to me. The tsunami is now 20 years in December 2004. So working with the ASEAN and many governments, we're actually doing a study of where we are in terms of BBB 20 years later. And I was involved in leading it 5 years later after the tsunami. It was a published document, and then 10 years later, it was not a public document. So, lots to cover, but how are they integrated in the policy? One, it is in the Sendai Framework. The principles are embedded in post-disaster needs assessment and disaster recovery framework. Since 2014, when we started monitoring how recovery are being undertaken through the post-disaster needs assessment and recovery framework, over 70 governments are already leading it. And it's also adapted to conflict and pandemic. They are comprehensive in scope. They are embedded in 18 sectors. So, for example, during the earthquake in Nepal in 2015, the Gorkha earthquake, I was deployed as advisor on how you incorporate disaster risk reduction into the earthquake, post-earthquake. I wrote the chapter on that in the post-disaster needs assessment. I was asked to see how preparedness, disaster risk reduction, and building resilience are incorporated in all sectors. So this is one example of how policies have adopted the Build Back Better principle. And now we have a discussion, and I hope I can discuss that during the second part of the discussion. How do you then incorporate climate, in particular, the warming of Earth, and many other challenges? So that's another set of discussion we can include. But the point about financing is to reaffirm or to confirm my observation with what the colleague from Mercy Gore has said. Despite of these policies, better frameworks, it takes a long time for communities to recover. You said 3 years, no? 2 years. For Banda Aceh, they set a time of 4 years. For the Fukushima Great East Japan earthquake, it was 15 years. So this is where financing for immediate recovery becomes a problem because we heard that it is not enough. Most of the funding actually are absorbed by the government, and therefore they ask for loans. When I presented in the transitional committee about the status of financing for major disasters with PDNA, it was not an empirical research, but it's about hovering around between 18 to 20% of what was the total amount needed for recovery. And no empirical evidence, depending on the geopolitics of a country. The comment earlier made about majority of them are actually loans, which further increase the debt burden to countries. So what's the help? And I hope I can cover all of this. If I'm a doctor of medicine, and I'm not, here's my opinion, to use the metaphor about the nexus and the connection. There's plenty of problem, and this includes the patients feeling fatigue, body pain, get easily exhausted, and that's who we are, and very likely age-related. So let's reflect on the humanitarian system. How old is the humanitarian system now? And whether there's a need to reform, as we have discussed during the World Humanitarian Summit. It's not enough. The patient's body, brain, limbs, and legs are not in sync, which is the fragmentation and silos, but one element affects the other. The patient is still recovering from COVID, and the patient doesn't have much money to cure the illness. So that's probably a metaphor of where we are right now. So, but disaster risk reduction, climate resilience, early warning system, anticipatory action work. We have a lot of very good examples that they work. In Bangladesh, I worked there from the 1990 cyclone, starting from 500,000 people getting killed to 140,000. Now, barely with the major cyclone, there's less than 10 people getting killed. Disaster risk reduction and recovery works. But also sustainable development intervention, such as creating jobs, promoting gender equality and inclusion, protection of ecosystems are also important contribution to building resiliency. And that are all important and pardon this expression, these are all important to reduce humanitarian needs, as we have committed during the World Humanitarian Summit. Three things that can be done. Long-term view is more important now. You know, the nexus is important, but long-term view is more important now because climate is not one weather event or 3 cyclones happening in 1 year or 20 cyclones in the Philippines where I come from happening in 1 year. It's long-term adjustment to a warming earth. And there are hotspots. There are hotspots, you know, they're not happening everywhere. This is the divide now happening in COP28, you know, which one should be prioritized? But it's important also to support now the discussion about multidimensionality of risk and resilience, which then connects to the importance of vulnerability, looking better, more importantly, the vulnerability, inequality, governance, and the degradation of ecosystem collectively, and there are many other factors. I'll stop there and I hope that's useful.
Thank you for that really comprehensive overview of, I think, policy frameworks, food for thought around where can we build from, where are some of the strengths. I think the example you gave as well around Bangladesh and how far things have moved in terms of disaster risk reduction is, I think, inspiring, but also highlights the gaps in terms of recovery. We're seeing reduction in loss of lives, but then where are people's livelihoods on the other side, and the gaps that people have in terms of rebuilding homes, rebuilding livelihoods, and rebuilding a support structure as well for families. And so I think that integration between disaster risk reduction and tackling the gap on recovery leads us to a discussion around, I think, solutions. Mm-hmm. We've heard where that is. And I'm mindful, if I could go first to Jackson, if you could share a little bit. We've heard about policy frameworks. We've heard about what are enabling environments. What are some of the lessons learned in terms of devolved frameworks? Has that led to faster release of finance? What are some of the opportunities, and where, if there was additional financial support potentially coming from a new loss and damage fund or other mechanisms, what would you like to see scaled up and through where?
Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. I would like to say that devolved functions were designed in a way that they can bring services closer to the people. I think that is the original design. And for sure, they might be trying. Currently, for example, a global scenario of Kenya, we have laws around climate finance. All our devolved units have those laws. The laws have been adopted from the national laws of the country. So, you know, for us, policies help us. They're like financial instruments. Without a policy, you cannot have any financing. Without a policy in the county, even us as NGOs cannot support the county to implement part of the actions. However, that is not there yet in terms of the financing. There are many opportunities. And the first opportunity is we have to look to put the communities at the center of what we do. You see, if I am the community member, a disaster happens in my household, for sure I'll be the first responder. Let's look at a fire in my kitchen. I'll be the first one to try to put it out. Or I'll be the first one to be burned by the same fire. So let's look at that same scenario to the community as the main priority. So these communities are aware of on what affects them most. What they need is our guidance. You know, sometimes they are clouded in judgment. They might know everything, but because they are affected, they are living in destitution, devastation, they might not know how to prioritize. So how do we, it's an opportunity, how do we work with these communities to prioritize their actions, develop priorities within the same communities around disaster, around development, and ensure that they can be part of the governance processes. A scenario of Kenya, Kenya has a 5-year financial cycle, which is broken down annually. And we call it the County Integrated Development and Contingency Plans. It's a 5-year tool. Without this tool, you cannot be able to implement actions within the community. So if the action is not put in the CIDP, then your community already has lost out in whatever financing that will come through. Annually, then the same government comes to the same community or not to ask the same communities what are the other priorities that can be prioritized within the same year. So if a community does not participate in the annual development or budgeting cycle, then they lose out that year and no finance will go there. So if we help these communities to participate in the governance processes, that way we'll be leading them towards investments, funding going into the same communities, prioritization of the actions of whatever is they are being affected from, and they'll be able to start recovery before anyone else comes in. I think that's the key component that we work around. And the other thing is around the knowledge of these communities. You know, you cannot, for example, you cannot tell people to protect the environment without them understanding why they're protecting in the first place. So you have to empower these local communities, inform them consultatively why they need to protect the environment, inform them to understand the current scenarios. You know, there might be, you know, some of our communities, especially in the rural Kenya, have traditional ways of predicting weather. Nowadays, they tell us they don't even know. They're listening to radio. They can't use the traditional way of predicting weather anymore. What it means, there are other external factors affecting these communities they're not aware of around environment. So we need to tell them that it's not your fault that this environment is like this, but there are other factors coming from outside, and you need to help you. Let's work together to be able to ensure that the environment is protected and whatever comes in this community can be able to be harnessed. And once they understand that, once they understand the resources that are within and how they can be harnessed, the resources that are coming in and how they can be used, they'll be able for sure to work with us in this journey of recovery. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, another clear message on participation and engagement has to underpin everything. Priska, in terms of solutions, I know that you have particular experience in the Malawi Red Cross in terms of supporting and strengthening disaster law policy plans. Could you share a little bit about how that, your view on how that could maybe help with resilient recovery and creating the environment in which then we do see finance flow quicker and more effectively to the local level?
Thank you very much, Mele. I want to begin by saying that I'm not a legal expert, but at least we have supported the Malawi government in terms of doing a mapping exercise around the legislature that deals with the issues of disaster risk management. So in terms of the national laws, policies, frameworks, we believe, yes, they have a role in as far as resilience and recovery efforts are concerned. For instance, we look at them as something that provides guidance in terms of how do we do assessments, who is involved in what, and even issues of implementation of different strategies, institutional arrangements, who is going to be coordinating all the disasters in the country, among other things that we believe the roles are there to provide. So by indeed having these frameworks, we hope that they are able to address the risks and promote preparedness, but also facilitate recovery processes. Therefore, the communities are able to bounce back stronger from the various shocks and crises. I want to give a very good example of what probably happened in Malawi. As we speak at the moment, we did support the government of Malawi to just do, like I mentioned, we did a study on international disaster law. That was around 2013, where we supported the government to do consultations with different stakeholders to just look at what are the gaps and strengths around these frameworks. And the recommendations informed the revision of some of the DRM structures, policies that we have. So as we are speaking at the moment, at least the DRM bill that was there has been passed into a law. What does it mean to us? To us, it's a success that at least we did contribute in terms of influencing or at least supporting to advocate for revision of those frameworks. So in the current DRIM Act that was passed this year, around April, there are provisions which are already clarifying in terms of the roles of different line departments. They have also put a provision around funding mechanisms to support disaster preparedness, response, and all that. But also, there are provisions around already saying having the Office of the President being responsible for disaster-related issues. And also, they've set aside a national disaster risk management team that is being headed by the Commissioner for disaster management, and then several stakeholders and part and parcel of which Malawi Red Cross is also part of that, where the Secretary General is supposed to sit there just to deliberate on disaster risk management issues. Again, it also provides a provision to say everyone else that is doing interventions around the DRM should be accountable, must report to the government. So we feel having these structures is really important in as far as recovery response preparedness are concerned. But we also feel as the stakeholders, I think there's more that we can do, because as we are speaking at the moment, yes, we are saying we now have the DRM Act. Whatever I'm saying here, I don't think every Malawian knows at the moment. Therefore, we need to also continue supporting the government in terms of disseminating the same, because again, we did also take notice when we had the tropical cyclone Alfredo to say, even before the DRM bill was passed as an act, we noted that the different actors that were consulted on how we can improve the legal frameworks, they were able also to provide quick assistance around the different roles in as far as, for example, where international assistance is concerned. So definitely making an improvement in terms of quick support where international assistance is concerned, coordination of different actors, already clarifying the role of different actors with the government, even for stakeholders like Malawi Red Cross Society, to say what is your role in as far as disaster risk management is concerned, and who is responsible for example, declaring a state of disaster when we have disaster. So all these things are being guided by the legal frameworks around disaster risk management. Thank you.
Thank you, Priska. And I think also an important point around connecting that to disaster risk financing and how they can look at processes where that's pre-identified as well. I might turn to Nemo for your reflections in terms of following on again from maybe the declaration on climate relief, recovery and peace. Some of the kind of gaps and challenges and solutions might feel different. I think the declaration gave an indication of that, but there were also some, I think, gaps. You'd mentioned the lack of fulfillment of the grand bargain, the move of finance to local actors and communities to be able to act fast and to build that in then to resilience efforts, and also the gap in terms of risk appetite as well, to be able to truly transform and take action. Curious on building on those barriers, what are the solutions or ways that people need to act differently in order to really see a movement Thanks.
Very big questions. I wish I had a magic wand to give us all the good ways to do it. Well, let me maybe just start by recognizing the work that a lot of institutions, both international and local, are actually doing in Somalia and have been doing for a long time, especially when there was no government or governments. We have a federal system, but the government is now starting to establish its institutions, which is really, the responsibility for the citizens lies on the government, and if the government is supported, then maybe those gaps between policy and implementation will close. So starting with that recognition, there's a lot of humanitarian response, saving lives. Famine was averted last year. There's a lot of work going on now to support the victims of the floods. There's a lot of resilience building as well, especially a lot of it through cash transfers and giving the communities the ability to, taking charge of their own lives, basically. So you giving them the money that will empower them to prioritize where their priorities lie. Having said that and acknowledging that, the scale of the need is far bigger than the resources that are going into Somalia at the moment. And the ability of the government to raise its own revenues as well. And you've mentioned about the loans already putting a bigger burden on the governments as well. I'll try and outline a couple of things that we need to do collectively, and I think it's definitely a collective approach and outcome, recognizing the strength of each partner, and truly honoring the principles of partnerships, that I bring something to the table, you bring something to the table, we work together to ensure we're resolving an issue. And that's the end goal, right? The end goal is to support those communities who are affected, and the diversity within the communities. Earlier on in our discussions, it came up that we, as a panel, we didn't mention the marginalized groups, the vulnerable groups within the vulnerability, people with disability, marginalized, gender, women, children. So we need to take all of that into account, and a lot of us have different expertise and are good at certain interventions than others. So if we're a true partnership, then we can complement and strengthen the way we deliver. I wish we'll be in a world soon where an unearmarked funding is given to a particular community, and then for the community to decide. But at the moment, everything is earmarked, and there are a lot of silos to, even from the donor side, to particularly we're interested in this particular sector because this matches our political agenda or whatever it may be. And then truly we could have the community on board then and be at the center in its diversity to address and take lead on what their priorities are in supporting. So the approach, you said the humanitarian system is how old and maybe outdated and maybe it needs to be revolutionized, but not necessarily just the humanitarian sector. The whole sector needs to be revolutionized. It's outdated, certainly. It's not bringing about the desired outcome. And I hope the desired outcome is to support and elevate poverty and give people dignity and, justice. So maybe what I'm saying in all of these blabs that I'm blabbing is that if we want to do things, it cannot be business as usual. if we want to see the declaration and the loss and damage fund to actually make a real change, then it cannot be it cannot be business as usual, and we have to learn from this amazing approaches and methods that are working already in certain places for us to deliver the desired outcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that, and some clear guidance as well around what is working and how we could scale that up, and also a really different way of looking at partnerships. We can't just be doing business as usual, and I think the loss and damage conversation and actually a lot of the hard work in terms of implementation and shaping and how does community access look will now be starting, and so I think that opportunity for local actors to engage, to shape that and to share what are the barriers and what are the solutions will be absolutely critical. Really keen in concluding the panel before we invite our next speaker up to hear their reflections is, Sani, you had been, you'd shared some of your advice from UNDP to the Transitional Committee throughout this year. You've also had a seat on the support unit as well of the Transitional Committee, and it would be great to get your thoughts on where you think the status of integrating resilient recovery has fallen within the text, and any thoughts on moving forward, and advice for us. And also UNDP, I believe, is also taking up or has been invited to take up a support in the interim secretariat as well. So it would be great to hear your thoughts on where have we got to and what's next.
What's next?
For UNDP and for
No,
us all.
no, that's a very relevant question. Maybe I should ask one question. How many actually expected that in day one, the loss and damage fund will be decided to be operationalized? How many? How many expected that that's going to happen? Oh, great. I should get your name and find out how we can foretold the next one. There's still a lot of counterfactuals, no? You know, the what if and conditionalities, the what should happen. And from the perspective of myself, it's not a UNDP perspective at the moment, because this is something that we all institutions have to grapple with. You know, what is your institutional opinion about the establishment and the operationalism of the loss and damage fund? Our comment essentially, we welcome it, and we will work with governments and program countries to ensure that this becomes successful. But what goes beyond that is something that everybody, I think, is talking about. No? So I'm hoping that that's a message that comes to everyone. So if Salimul Haq is sitting there, he will be the happiest person, no? And he will ask the same question, no? You know, he will go back to the communities in Bangladesh and what am I bringing the message? And it's also a very difficult question, even for someone who is so seasoned in this negotiation. I don't think Salimul Bai will have an answer to the question. But this is where I think we can, however, commit on what we could do in the next 12 months. And the question you have raised is very, very relevant. Yes, there are discussions about the money is insufficient, $700 million now. Yes, there's discussion about the selection of the World Bank as the fund trustee. Yes, there is a discussion about the 11 conditionalities and the three exit plans if the conditionalities are not met. So which means 6 months from now, it will be probably a revisit of the decisions made on November 30. So the next COP29 could be a different set of discussions that will lead to another set of directions. So I cannot say, how do we integrate loss and damage decision to resilient recovery at the moment. But it is important to say, as I said earlier, that, yeah, we have a strong core. We do DRR, we do a lot of community work, these are all very important core, but the capital loss and capital L and D, the capital loss and damage, is currently a political process. So the first thing that I would say is, for people who are here, and we are actually being criticized now, over 120,000 people are here in Dubai. How do we bridge this global policy decision into action on the ground? That's what Salim will be saying to us. How do you bridge this global policy into local action? What will we do in the next 12 months? And this is where it is important to say now that that tweaking what we do already is not enough. You said that, revolutionize. Maybe the word is reform, but it's certainly a new paradigm. Someone had said, because UNDP works on governance, someone had said this will require a different governance. But I think some of the core that are important is that it's a development issue. I heard it from the previous panel. No? It's failure of development, it's failure of mitigation, it's failure of adaptation, and then we have loss and damage, which should not be costed if we have done the development in the first place. The last point that I should make is, how do you bring the climate justice into the discussion of formulating resilient recovery? I actually don't know, because the current practice of recovery are guided by strategic investments, trade-offs, cost-benefit analysis, and doesn't include the climate justice narrative. So I hope that doesn't deflate the enthusiasm about the creation and adaptation of the loss and found, but we have a lot of things to do, at least in the next 12 months. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And she said it's been a long fight to get to a loss and damage fund that has happened. There's a moment to bank that extraordinary achievement at last COP, and then to get the decision text agreed at the very opening of this COP. We're delighted to have Mackay Robertson join us, who's been part of that process, was one of the transitional committee members as well, representing Antigua and Barbuda, AOSIS as well, negotiator, and really keen to get your reflections, first of all, on the status of where we are. I think a lot of the questions and issues which have been brought up around the gaps and opportunities, I think, do lie around community access. How do we work towards the access window? What was envisaged by that? And really keen to get your thoughts on where you think collectively we need to act in the coming number of months and year to support a really successful fund, and any thoughts on the Santiago network and how to engage would also be most welcome. Mackay, thank you for joining us. And over to you.
No, thank you. And thank you to the amazing panelists. I think it was really good to hear, and I came from working in government, but it was really good to hear the underground experiences, especially from those three particular countries, because I think having those experiences in mind, and we heard a lot of that and brought our own experiences to the transitional committee, really fought hard to try and integrate it. As you could see with the scars of, as our colleague from UNDP highlighted, the 11 conditionalities, if you look at it really and truly, there are about 4 buckets. There are conditionalities on administrative matters like privileges and immunities, hiring the ED. There were ones that generally reflected on things like eligibility, right? Eligibility of countries, etc., noting the World Banks. But the sort of main one that kind of was a huge focus and a huge battle is direct access. And it's quite transparent at how the World Bank treats direct access, and it was one of the things in which, even to the point where we were interacting in the TC with the bank, there wasn't even the ability to get that assurances. And the many other funds that they did have, they clearly highlighted that is not an issue that they want to entertain because of, for example, reputational risk, etc. You have multiple entities that you want to engage with. So all of the different entities that you just highlighted on the community on the ground that want to directly access it, who may not want to go through UN agencies, international organizations, which, at least from my perspective, are as susceptible to prohibited practices like corruption, etc. Many different UN agencies, international bodies, and more so, I would rather personally trust money with a national entity as opposed to a go-between. And as well, I think there's an argument in the context of sustained capacity, right? So at the end of the day, even though the price of direct access might be very high, potentially compared to a UN agency, multilateral development bank, even though I don't think the empirical data is there, I think in the end it's worth it, right? Because then you build the Red Cross, right? You build your institution, which, as you said, has the institutions, has the laws already in place. And so it was really heartwarming to hear all of the different realities on the ground, that the enabling environments are very much so there because it was out of the necessity, and that your countries paid for that primarily, right? So I just wanted to highlight and then just say kudos to you guys on making very, very good interventions. Resilient recovery, and it's important. It's crucial. It's the hallmark. It's one of the bedrocks in which the loss and damage funding arrangements were established. But I do want to highlight that in envisioning the fund, even though it didn't reach into the governing instrument of the fund, the main document that constituted the fund, there was a clear discussion between there being an ability to have a side of the portfolio that was trigger-based or event-based, things that dealt with exogenous shocks, etc., very much so pre-arranged finance-oriented, as highlighted by Barbara. And then there was another camp kind of discussing the concept of a programmatic approach. And I really, after hearing the multiple interventions and long-term focus on long-term recovery, as highlighted by all the panelists, I think that it is quite clear that there is even further buy-in beyond those transitional committee members who stated about having a programmatic approach as opposed to a project-based approach. It seems that there's a lot of buy-in for that. And so I'll just quickly go into what next, going forward. There's a board, right? There's a board that has been established. There's a board that's going to be constituted. There's a board that has an entire year of work to wrangle with the World Bank about conditions. That's one thing. But it's quite clear, even that we've had discussions informally with those who are already in the process, is that we're already focused on the policies, right? The World Bank, okay, that's great, right? We'll figure that out. And either they accept the invitation or not. However, this fund is going ahead. So we're not waiting until COP29 to then start to do policies. We want to hit the ground running. And so a couple of things that we need to look at is things like the commitment authority of the fund, right? Essentially, what that is how much money, how much cash is on hand, right? And when you're thinking about the programmatic long-term recovery, it's going to be different than how you conceptualize the commitment authority of the Green Climate Fund, of the Global Environmental Facility, of the Adaptation Fund. You then, because you are making a commitment to the government of Malawi or the Malawi Red Cross, right, that you're going to give money potentially a 20-year horizon, 30-year horizon, right? Financially, you have to think about how do you make sure you make that commitment programmatically, then you make that programmatic commitment to a country in the Pacific, somewhere else in Asia, so there is going to be, we're going to have to look at those policies and engage with it in a different way that we've done with typical climate funds. Next thing is in relation to contributors and policies around contributors. So the form of financing, the concessionality of financing coming from the contributors, mind you, yes, we had a really good, start to the contributions, which was great. I think we're over 700 million. However, we don't know the form of that financing. We don't know how much of it is potentially concessional loans or grants, right? And that will dictate as well how you go about dealing with and divvying out programmatic sort of funding in a long-term basis, and as well the fact that the way that funds work is that you cannot give grants to a country. So if you have financial inputs, that's a loan. You can't give financial outputs that are grants, right? It's just not good financial management unless there is some sort of way to sort of discount that. So I think this is a discussion we tried to have at the TC, but we really didn't get to unpack. I think the other couple of things was, as I highlighted again on the access modalities and direct access, the issue with that typically, especially we learned from the GCF, is that once you start to talk about direct access entities, a lot of partners talk about accreditation, right? There is no accreditation that was built into the fund. There was a discussion on functional equivalence, which hopefully will be a lower version of some sort of understanding the system. So for example, we look at the laws that you have in Kenya and we see that, okay, X, Y, and Z, you have a program of X, Y, and Z, and your laws are fit for purpose in order to make sure that you have the environmental, social safeguards to program sort of recovery activities, right? So we need to look and develop, the access framework for the fund, and that's going to have to be done before we start to give out money. The next thing is the different policies on environmental and social safeguards, which in the last event that we had in Bonn, I had a lot of questions to colleagues on how do you do it, especially in a rapid recovery way, to note that you give out money quite quickly, but taking into consideration how do you protect the environment, how do you protect society, and how do you incorporate gender? It's a tough ask, right? But this is the space that we have to be in. And the thing is that, again, the bank in itself and the approach that it is used potentially for ESS and gender isn't necessarily fit for purpose for potentially what countries envision and what they want, because it sometimes becomes barriers to access. So we need to find it's a delicate balance. And so there are going to have to be tough discussions in the first year. The last thing that I would say is on results management, right? And so the results management, we do need to have a discussion on a framework for results management and how do you track long-term recovery. We're looking at this temporally in a different space than we were with adaptation, right? So how do you understand long-term recovery in the context of mental health? How do you understand long-term recovery in the context of physical health, in relation to education, in relation to addressing loss of cultural heritage? We do it a lot in the context of physical assets, income, etc. But we need to start to think about indicators and tracking results in that. So I'll stop right here and hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mackay, and I think some clear takeaways. I've written down in terms of functional equivalence. I feel like that's what we need to look into, but I think that the charge as well on social and environmental frameworks, I think what we would say as well is around community engagement and accountability mechanisms as well being part of this, and I think there's a clear action that all of us need to take in the room in terms of engaging in these policies starting from today and early next year to be able to shape, share experience and make sure that the policies that are put in place are effective, and we also listen to each other across climate development, humanitarian, and think about different timescales. As you say, a 20 to 30 year horizon is really what we need to be thinking about. I just want to say a warm thank you to everyone who's attended today. A copy of the report is available on the ZEFRA website. There's also 2 other resources which have been endorsed by the WMEXCOM, which ZEFRA has worked on. One on minimising loss and damage, the role of early warning, early action systems, and something which will be published, I believe, tomorrow, which is a summary guide of the IPCC Working Group 2 report, summarising in an accessible way what was said on loss and damage. So please do check that out. Thank you for your time. I would encourage you to speak to somebody on your way out, connect with a new face, and thank you for being with us today. Thanks to all of our panellists as well. But it would be great to kind of pick up a little bit.